something. I find it better when there's so many people who actually can't see and focus on that. I'm waiting for buoy, growing. I wonder who's
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me? All right. Well, first of all, I would like you all to turn off your electronic devices so we don't disturb the speakers. Well, with that said, welcome to a closer look into Venezuela event. Thank you all for coming, and I wanted to especially thank those who helped organize this event. Austrivias, which is with Vena UK and Mojadesa. They have made this happen as well. Yeah. So the event is going to go with the speakers speaking for 20 minutes each. They're going to give a presentation, and then there's going to be questions and answers for 30 minutes, which will be chaired by Dr. Francisco Panizza. With that said, I would like to address the reason why we're all here, Venezuela, obviously. So to try to decipher what the current and past events will mean for the future of Venezuela, how the ideological and at times physical confrontations will converge and hopefully make a more peaceful country. Something that will inevitably happen is that there are people with diverse ideologies and proposals to construct a more successful country. All of these people will live together on the boundaries of the same nation, Venezuela. It is up to the people of Venezuela to decide if they will live cohesively with one another or in struggle. As Mandela once said, our single most important challenge is therefore to help establish a social order in which the freedom of the individual will truly mean the freedom of the individual. We must construct a people-centered society of freedom in such a manner that it guarantees the political liberties and the human rights of all our citizens. I will now present the chairman of the event, Dr. Francisco Panizza. Dr. Panizza is the Associate Professor in Latin American Politics in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's also the head of the Latin America International Affairs Research Program of the Research Center LSESU. His main research interests are democracy and human rights in Latin American politics, politics and the economy of the Mercosur countries, populism, left-of-center governments in Latin America, and the politics of financial crisis and comparative perspectives.
Good evening. I'll just make the briefest presentation to our speakers in the order they are going to speak. As Vanessa said, they're going to speak for about 20 minutes each, and then they will take a question from you. Next to me, and I think the first speaker is Professor George Philip, who is, as myself, from the Department of Government, of which we have worked together for a number of years. Professor Phillips is one of the most distinguished Latin Americans in this country, and he has written extensively about Venezuela and about particularly the politics of oil in Venezuela and elsewhere in Latin America. Our second speaker is Kate Parker from the Economist Intelligence Unit. Kate has been a member of the Economist Intelligence Unit Latin America for 6 years. She's currently the principal analyst for Venezuela, Mexico, Panama, and Cuba, but has previously covered most countries in the region, as well as the Latin American Region Overview publication. Kate is also part of the Economist Intelligence Unit product development team working on the business environmental ranking. And on the extreme left is
so unfair.
Another very dear friend, Dr. Julia Buxton, who is a professor in the School of Public Policy at the Central European University in Budapest. She has written several books, journal articles, and media commentaries about Venezuela, and was previously adjunct professor in the Edmund J. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where she directed the Venezuela Studies program. She's currently focusing on the inter-American security system and the implications of new regional peace and security norms for hemispheric ties. So with any further ado, I will ask George to start the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the questions that periodically exercises social scientists is why oil-rich countries or oil-exporting countries don't really succeed in developmental terms and end up with political problems as well as economic difficulties of one sort or another. Venezuela, in a way, is a paradigm case of a country with lots of oil which hasn't really succeeded in political or economic terms and is, if anything, going to a kind of downward spiral with increasingly contentious politics and increasingly difficult economic situation. But with Venezuela, the why question is not so very difficult to answer. Venezuela is not producing enough oil. Venezuelan oil production at the moment is, according to the IEA, around 2.5 million barrels a day, maybe a little bit more. That is about what Venezuela was producing in 1955. And so in the last 50 years or so, 60 years now, there's been very little in the way of general growth in the oil industry. In 1970, when Venezuelan oil production was in the hands of the transnationals, Venezuela produced around 3.7 million barrels a day, with 200,000 barrels a day being sold on the domestic market. The most recent figures for 2011 puts oil production at 2.7 million barrels a day, slightly lower than when OPEC was formed in 1960. And of that, 780,000 barrels a day of oil products were sold at heavily subsidized prices on the domestic market. So the actual amount that Venezuela gets from its oil is related to about 1.8, 1.7 million barrels a day worth of oil. Not enough for a country with a population of 27 million people, which is still growing demographically. So when we understand why this should be, we can carry forward a little bit more our question of why oil hasn't led to development. One hypothesis what we can exclude is absence of oil reserves. At the end of 2011, Venezuela was estimated to have reserves of some 300,000 million barrels, more than any other country in the world, with a reserve production ratio of over 100 years. Admittedly, there are complications here. There are technical issues to do with measuring oil reserves, which I'm not competent to discuss and don't propose to discuss here anyway. As recently, as long ago as 1989, Venezuela was estimated to have had 53,000 million barrels a day of oil reserves and a reserve production ratio of 86.6 years. So that's not scarcity. Whatever you may think about the quality of reserves, the cost of production, the difficulties of particular oil fields, there's a lot of oil there, and it should be being produced for the benefit of the Venezuelan citizen. But so far it really isn't. Now, why is this not the case? Well, for the most part, governments associated with oil production and increasing output have been limited in terms of their domestic popularity. For example, the first major government to preside over an oil boom in Venezuela was Gomez, who was a dictator. Then, in the 50s, a major boom under Perez Jimenez, also a dictator. Then, in the 1990s, not a dictator, but a period of weak governments, and PDVSA's people, notably Luis Juste, took the law into their own hands and more or less carried out their personal oil policy and carried on and did at least increase in oil production. But the Juste policy of maximizing oil production was controversial within Venezuela, and it led to a conflict between Chavez and the oil companies, a major strike in PDVSA in 2002, and a period of damage from which the economy has not yet recovered. So the governments of Venezuela that have been associated with oil production increases have mostly either been too unpopular or too dictatorial to be able to maintain a model of growth that was satisfactory to the average Venezuelan or the Venezuelan people. On the contrary, the most popular policies of Venezuelan oil have been carried out when the governments have been nationalistic and have reduced production one way or another. Most obviously that's the case of OPEC, where Venezuela was one of the founding members of OPEC and played a major part in keeping oil production down in order to try and maintain the price at a time of international glut and abundance. And there's no doubt, I think, that Venezuelan oil production in the 60s and 70s was held back by OPEC, although maybe there were good reasons for this. And the policy of restraining production was, broadly speaking, popular. And consequently, Venezuela's share of world markets was reduced. And as a result of that, the potential income from oil was held back. And Venezuela had a fairly nasty 1980s when the price of oil fell and there wasn't enough production to maintain income when production was falling. Venezuela's membership of OPEC has never, I think, been seriously disputed by the Venezuelan authorities at the time, and the consequences of that has been, to a degree, to constrain production one way or another. More perhaps to the point as far as the current issues of development are concerned is the fact that Venezuelan oil production was held back by the modes of organization of the industry. Venezuela nationalized its oil in the 1970s at a time when its industry was in decline. It poured billions of dollars into the oil industry in the early 1980s, to the point that there was a kind of reaction formed against it, against that policy in the late 1980s and subsequently under Chavez. If we move forward from an earlier historical period to the contemporary Venezuela, Venezuela under Chavez had a president committed to making OPEC work and cutting production as necessary. The way in which Chavez operated was and is always has been political. He took the view that, and I quote, oil is a political commodity, and was key driver in formation of an alliance with Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and one or two other major oil producers to try and hold back production and maintain prices, which in a way worked because the price of oil increased dramatically in the early part of the current millennium. And Venezuela gained some benefit from higher oil prices. But the problem is with higher oil prices, you get caught into a corner because ultimately the amount of oil you're allowed to produce is determined by OPEC, and OPEC is a restrictor of oil production rather than a fomenter of it. And Venezuela's relatively low levels of oil production these days mean it doesn't have as much bargaining power within OPEC as it would hope to have, and the absence of which was a problem under Chavez, but is much more of a problem under Maduro, where Venezuela has not got the same reputation internationally under the present government as it did under the previous government, whether we like it or not. Not only is there an issue to do with OPEC, there's also to do with an issue of the organisation of PDVSA and the organisation of the oil industry. Venezuela nationalised its oil in 1976, and it did so on the basis of the mistaken idea that protecting the corporate autonomy of PDVSA would be the key to success. And that what you didn't want was any kind of politics interfering with the state enterprise. The trouble is that politics always interferes with state enterprises. That's what politics is for. And you can't have a pure technocratic model without political issues coming in through the back door. And consequently, there came to be an issue in the hands of the oil nationalists who felt that PDVSA had become too technocratic and too concerned with production and with corporate efficiency, and not concerned enough about what oil was doing for the average Venezuelan or for the people of the country. And that conflict with this to the present day. On the one hand, you've got people who think that oil is something that is politically necessary to maintain its low level for political reasons. And on the other hand, you've got corporate technocrats who were worried about insufficient oil for developmental purposes. And that conflict was played out with the strike in 2002-2003, and in the rather notorious incident with the elections of 2006, when Ramirez, the head of PDVSA, said that he was only interested in employing people who were red and who were pro-Chavista. And that line was echoed by Chavez himself, and certainly is not good for an oil company that needs to produce more oil. So Venezuela has had, after its nationalization, a technocratic model of oil production, and for a period of time that seemed to work. But the political line, which is by no means without merit in principle, increasingly gained traction within Venezuela. And now we're talking about the government, not the opposition, the government calling up for strikes in the state oil industry to try and maintain a bargaining position vis-à-vis the opposition. Now clearly that's not good for oil production, and it's not good for the positive sum politics that might come out of arising as a successful oil producing industry. On the contrary, it will take years now, I think, for oil production to recover from where it is now, and if it doesn't do so, Venezuela is going to be faced with increasingly negative sum politics and increasingly turbulent political atmosphere in the years to come. On which note I would say thank you very much.
Thank you. Kate?
Oh, I'm doing
I'm going to speak about the economy. I'm going to take a brief look at performance, economic performance in recent years and the policy framework, and then move on to what we expect this year and what, how events might unfold in the years to come. Oh, sorry, is that? Is that better?
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about the economy. I will take a brief look at economic performance in recent years, the policy framework under Chavez, how it unfolded, and have a look at where we stand now and what we expect in years to come, how things might unfold and implications for the government in terms of policy options. I think in terms of the economy, there's the idea that Venezuela has very much underperformed the region in recent years. Everywhere you turn, it seems that you read quite damning reports on the state of the economy. But I thought it would be quite useful to have a quick look at a chart looking at economic growth since 2000. And actually, you'll notice that the first thing you'll notice is that Venezuela has fared really badly in some years. Its economic upturns and downturns have been much more pronounced than most countries in the region. But actually, in many cases, after sharp downturns, it's bounced back very strongly the following year. And in 2012, which is the last year for which actual data is available, actually Venezuela didn't fare too badly. Many sort of larger economies in the region didn't do so well. There's a few reasons for this. As I'm sure you're all aware, as we've just heard from Dr. Philip, the economy is very much dependent on oil. But in contrast to much of the rest of the region, Venezuela has chosen not to put in place fiscal stabilization funds. So what that means is that Venezuela is not saving any of its oil windfall. It's spending it. And that means that the upturns are sharper, but the downturns are much more pronounced. So overall, growth hasn't been too bad. But there's quite a big note of caution here. If you look at what's been driving growth, it's almost entirely fueled by an increase in government spending, which in turn has been fueled by oil prices. If you look at private investment, which is really important in terms of building capacity to sort of sustain long-term growth, it's been really low. In fact, in some years it's contracted, sometimes by double digits. And this compares very starkly to countries like Colombia, Peru, Mexico, where growth has been much more sort of evenly balanced between the different components. It's also worth noting 2013 was a disappointing year. We're still waiting on the official data in most countries in the region, but the government stated that the economy grew by only around 1.5, 1.6%, one of the lowest rates in the region. It seems that Venezuela is back on this sort of downward trend. It peaked perhaps in 2012, and yeah, we're going on one of those sort of downward slopes again. Investment and exports both contracted really sharply last year, and actually the only reason keeping overall growth in positive territory was the fact that imports dropped even more sharply. Sorry. Yes, so in terms of the current situation, I thought I'd just compare Venezuela with other countries in the region last year. As you can see, it's a pretty disappointing state of affairs. You've got the region which is largely benefiting from much more sort of sound macro policies, also still high commodity prices. And overall, the region is expected to grow by getting on for 3.5–4% in the next 4 years, boosted by sort of a much stronger global picture and a lot of countries that are undertaking competitiveness-enhancing reforms, which is being accompanied by private investment. So moving back to Venezuela, in terms of the policy framework, it's highly unorthodox. Venezuela is very much struggling with deep problems in terms of the policy framework that are manifesting themselves in high levels of inflation, weak growth, a shortage of dollars, and as a result, difficulties in importing goods. Fiscal policy is highly expansionary. Just in terms of the numbers, I don't want to sort of throw too many figures in here, but government expenditure has risen from 26% of GDP to 43% in 2012, which in sort of comparative terms, is really high. We're seeing revenue levels which are fairly stable, and the result is a really large fiscal deficit. I mean, even by sort of Greece, Spain comparisons, I mean, that's massive. And it comes with difficulties in finance. And definitely, if you look at the sort of quality of expenditure, you look at current expenditure, which is things like wages, sort of transfers, subsidies, that kind of thing. Current spending has just shot through the roof, and capital expenditure, which is the kind of things sort of like investing in infrastructure, has really sort of it's gone up, but not by nearly as much as current spending. On the monetary policy front, it's very much sort of driven by fiscal policy needs. Sort of in an ideal world, you would have monetary and fiscal policy would be completely independent of each other. But what we've seen is that sort of the central bank has kind of lost independence over the years. By the way, sorry, my voice is going. The central bank is essentially sort of printing money, and Cuba is quite an interesting example in that they've got real problems with the dual exchange rate, and it's essentially because the fiscal deficit is entirely monetized. So they run this deficit, and the central bank prints money to finance it because they have no other financing options. And I mean, Venezuela is still sort of quite some way from that situation, but we're definitely moving towards that. And I'll come to quite an interesting chart in a minute, but essentially the scale of money printing that's gone on at the central bank has just been sort of incredible in recent years. And another thing to note is that interest rates in inflation-adjusted terms are highly negative. So there's essentially not much incentive for people to save. So this kind of economic growth that we've seen is just driven by, just driven by spending and government increases in government expenditure. In terms of the sort of growing presence of the state, we've seen increasingly difficult environment for foreign and private investors, well-publicised nationalisations across many sectors, and just to sort of emphasise the point, increasing difficulty in accessing dollars and remitting profits, which, I mean, to be quite frank, you know, it's a massive concern for anyone considering investing in Venezuela, and it's one of the reasons we're seeing people, you know, actual firms actually leave Venezuela. So this is the growth, the chart that I wanted to emphasise. It's money supplies, so essentially it's looking at all the cash in circulation in the economy added to bank deposits. So it's very much a sort of an indication of, essentially how much the central bank is printing. And what I did was rebase Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, and the Ukraine back to all have the same base in January 2003, and then just kind of plot how things have panned out since then. And actually, the amount of money, local currency money that has been in circulation has grown 63 times since the beginning of 2003. And you can see the other countries. I put Ukraine on there because it's, you know, kind of the sort of basket case, sort of emerging market, just to make the point that it's, you know, there are major problems there, but Venezuela is just off the scale. And that very much, you know, you've got your exchange rate, which is determined by sort of supply and demand of local currency and foreign exchange. And, you know, it's hardly surprising when you look at a chart like that, you know, why they've got problems with inflation and an exchange rate issue and with the black market as well. It's essentially, it's a problem of money supply. And I just wanted to make the point, I mean, this is quite a general slide, that so we have Venezuela that's underperforming in the region, but I just wanted to make the point that, that actually, when you compare to other emerging markets, which people, you know, often do, and developed markets as well, that actually Latin America isn't, you know, is underperforming other regions. So, you know, I don't want to be too depressing about this, but, you know, Venezuela is not well placed compared across the region and with other regions as well. I suppose a large part of my job is forecasting, and it's really, really tough on Venezuela because it's just so difficult. It's such a sort of unorthodox policy framework. It's so difficult to know how things might play out. I mean, I've put our sort of baseline macro forecasts in there. So we're expecting a recession this year, very sort of minor growth from 2015, and 2016 onwards, it's it's very much dependent on the political situation. But I mean, I would say that's quite a benign forecast. I mean, it's always very difficult to forecast in sort of economic crises. But I would say that's base case. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if there is some kind of recession within that period. I mean, this year it's very difficult to see how the economy won't contract. You have inflation, which is, I think it's the highest in the world, and is set to continue to rise further. Very weak investor confidence. I mean, I'm sure this will come up in Q&A, but obviously the protests, the kind of bad press that Venezuela is getting as a result of that, very sort of great deal of uncertainty on macro policy, particularly access to US dollars. George has spoken about oil and oil production falling, and that's very much, I mean, just directly correlated to exports, and that it also plays it feeds into other things, so that very much affects the current account surplus, and as a result, because you have capital flight at the same time, and as a result you have reserve levels which are falling, and given problems with the exchange rate and trying to prop that up, I think there'll be continuing concern about how much Venezuela has in liquid reserves, and related to that, uncertainty about actually how big the fiscal deficit is and public debt. I mean, there's a problem because the finance ministry stopped publishing data, I think, since 2011. So, it's kind of guesswork as to how big the fiscal deficit is. But I mean, I assume by the fact that they're not publishing data that it's not good. So, in terms of policy options open to the government, this is where it gets really difficult. I mean, essentially, these are distortions. These are distortions that have built up over the last decade. The government's very much backed into a corner, and kind of what to tackle first. I mean, it's just. I mean, I don't envy Maduro. I don't envy the government. I mean, I think a lot of the problems are, problems of their own making. But I personally can't see any kind of easy way out. If you look at inflation, to bring that down, you either need to increase the supply of goods, which means facilitating access to dollars to purchase imports, or you need to increase how much the country produces. But then that's a long-term effort and requires investment. Alternatively, you need to reduce demand, but then you have to cut back on your fiscal stimulus. That brings growth down. So, there's no easy solution to inflation. In terms of looking at shortages, I mean, essentially, the country needs more dollars, and you can't magic them out of thin air. I think one possibility is cutting some of the oil agreements like PetroCaribe, alternatively boosting oil production. But again, this is a long-term effort, and as George mentioned, not likely anytime soon. In terms of the exchange rate distortions, obviously this has had perhaps the most press in recent months, just because of the level of the black market rate. It's again a really difficult one. If you devalued the official rate, that would feed into inflation. But if you looked at lifting or easing controls, in the current policy environment, you would just spark massive capital flight. And then you look at the fiscal deficit, how to reduce it. You could cut spending, but this would probably push the economy into recession. There's no easy way to look, to think about raising revenues. The revenue base is really narrow based on oil. So yeah, there's nothing, there's no easy solution. So in terms of what the government will do, I mean, I suspect it will be more of the same, continuing. There's nothing they can do that wouldn't push the economy into recession. So I think it's just a case of sort of trying to maintain some sort of form of order. I expect they'll make a big thing of the fact that, if economic growth is in positive territory, that that it's growing. But I think anyone in the ground will realise that actually that's not a fair reflection of what's happening in terms of people's lives. So yeah, I suspect it will just push things a step further down the line. And I think what this probably means that when there is a crisis, we've had years and years of these problems building up, that it's going to be, I expect it will be messy. I don't know how it would unfold, but I think the fact that it's delayed will mean that it's like a snowball. It's going to be more problematic when it happens. And finally, I thought I'd end on something on oil prices. It actually gives the economy some breathing space. I mean, limited, but my colleague who sits next to me covers Argentina, and it's quite interesting comparing the two. And the distortions in Argentina are arguably not as severe. They're different, but arguably not as severe as in Venezuela. But yet, you know, the likelihood of crisis in Argentina, of immediate crisis, seems more probable. And essentially, the fact that Venezuela has oil, you know, it allows the government to continue, you know, as normal as normal gets. So, yeah, I mean, we can see how oil has increased, and George made the really good point that, you know, the economy should be doing much better considering oil prices have risen so much in recent years. But what we're seeing is that they have kind of peaked 2011, 2012, and that essentially oil markets, like other commodity markets, have very much benefited from quantitative easing in the global economy, particularly the United States. So as this is wound down, this is going to have an impact on oil markets, and prices will edge down. There'll be a floor, definitely, because supply in some OPEC countries is perhaps quite unstable, related to political instability, also higher costs of extraction. But if you look at the long-term picture, you're seeing rising production in places like Brazil, Russia. The States, I think, had its oil production rose more sharply than any other major producer last year. And so this will bring the price down. And this is going to cause problems in Venezuela. I mean, I think there's been a lot of sort of discussion about the point at which oil prices fall sufficiently to, you know, to cause severe problems or a crisis in Venezuela. And it, you know, you can do modelling and to try and see, you know, to gauge where that point is, and, you know, that's very difficult. But at some point, prices will come down sufficiently to increase the government's problems. So I think that, in terms of when the economy, when we might see some kind of crisis, I think it will be very much related to oil prices, but potentially, you know, within the next 4 years. So, yeah, are we doing Q&A at the end? Yeah.
Julia Buxton.
Thank you, Francisco. Well, George has had the technical stuff on oil to talk about, and Kate's had the statistics, and I get the really uncontroversial and non-problematic issue area of how we explain Venezuela's political confrontation. So I think we should bear the words of Mandela in the backs of our minds that we open with. And also to say that I am mindful of sensitivities as we discuss this topic, and that many of you will probably also want to speak and make comments given events of the recent weeks, and particularly this last week. And secondly, I'm also mindful of the fact that I'm not Venezuelan, and I don't live in Venezuela, and I don't have family in Venezuela. And I have been reminded of this every day over the last week through thousands of tweets that I have been bombarded with, telling me that I simply don't know the reality of Venezuela. Now, on closer inspection, it transpires that many of these people who have been tweeting me have actually only existed for a day, and during that course of time have managed to accumulate 40,000 followers. I'll come back to this point in my closing remarks. So the comments that I'm going to make, of which there are 3, basically come from my 20 years of working in and on Venezuela. It's 20 years ago this year I started my PhD on a very small left-wing Venezuelan party called La Causa R, with my PhD supervisor, George Philip. And so it's really through the perspective of this long-term engagement on Venezuela, these 20 years of observing every election process in the country, and working with stakeholders in Venezuela from across the political spectrum, that I really kind of gauge the 3 comments that I'm going to make today. So, in terms of explaining what's happening in Venezuela, my first explanation of what's happening in Venezuela is that we have a student opposition movement and sections of the MUD opposition alliance which are engaged in what I consider to be wholly counterproductive protests. And I believe that these protests will set back the Venezuelan opposition for years. And I think they're particularly counterproductive in light of the possibility that a recall referendum opens up for a pacific and peaceful way forward in Venezuela's current political crisis. Now, I think these actions are particularly unfortunate on 2 counts. Firstly, I think the MUD has made enormous strides since 2008. I think under Enrique Capriles, the opposition has moved away from strategies of coups and boycotts and sabotage towards an electoral path. And through this electoral path, from 2008 onwards, regional, national and local elections, the opposition has focused on bread and butter issues that matter to Venezuelan voters. The MUD has focused on a moderation of its language, which reassures people who may be wavering or alienated Chavistas, people who are scared of change. So this moderation of language is essential for a democratic and peaceful way forward. And thirdly, and I think the most important advance that's been made by the MUD under Capriles, is that they have engaged with the concerns of the poor. For the first 4 or 5 years, the Venezuelan opposition argued that it would remove the benefits that had been delivered. They argued over the nature and the quality of the benefits that had been delivered to the poor of Venezuela. And this was utterly, utterly counterproductive for the opposition, because in numerical terms and in terms of the votes and the way that people vote in Venezuela in blocks, there was no way the opposition were ever going to win an election until they took on board the concerns of Venezuela's poor. And I think that has been the most significant shift that occurred under Capriles. And this reaped for the MUD significant electoral dividends. I think it transformed them into a credible political alternative to Chavismo. And we've seen this in the strong votes that the opposition were able to galvanize in urban areas, and how they have managed to win over many alienated and floating voters in Venezuela. And I think the performance of Capriles in the April 2013 presidential election was extraordinary. I think it was extremely strong. Now, this has not been easy for Capriles to achieve within the MUD, because the changes and the transformations over the last few years have required him to marginalize impatient and intolerant voices within the opposition organization. Now, at times, I think Capriles' actions have been reasonably counterproductive, and I think this is explained by his need to have to balance radical factions with more moderate factions within the MUD. I think, in particular, what's been problematic for Capriles has been this tendency to have an in and out position on an election process, entering into an electoral competition whilst at the same time challenging the credibility and the viability of an election process before it's occurred. I was observing the elections in Venezuela in April, and the people I spoke to who supported the opposition were very confused about whether Capriles was telling them to boycott the vote and to not participate because it was a fraudulent system that couldn't be trusted, but then at the same time Capriles was calling on people to go out and vote in order that they could change the political regime. So I actually think it was the mixed messages that Capriles was giving to MUD supporters, rather than election fraud or irregularities, that cost Capriles those 1.52% of votes that would have ultimately led to regime change in Venezuela in April. Now, despite the setback of April, I would argue that Capriles has recovered over recent months. I think he is now recognized by the Venezuelan government as the legitimate and credible leader of the opposition. And I think this change in how the government views Capriles should not be underestimated. He is now seen as being the key opposition leader, the person with whom there has to be engagement with in the event we are to have dialogue. So I think this has been an important advance, and this is the second reason why I think these current protests are unfortunate and ill-timed. that with the recent murder that we've seen of Monica Spear in Venezuela and this enormous attention which has been given to a dire and chronic security situation, I do believe that we had the opportunity for a dialogue. I think it was a brief glint, it was a very, very small and brief opening, but it was nonetheless one of the most significant advances that we've seen in Venezuela in terms of the possibility of a dialogue in a long, long time. And it is precisely at this moment when we are looking at the possibility of a dialogue. Yes, we all understand, in any conflict situation it's difficult, there has to be negotiations on either side, people are concerned about what the motivation of the other party might be. But in the context of a chronic insecurity problem which affects everybody in Venezuela and everybody who visits and works in Venezuela, this was an important opportunity that I think should have really allowed and been able to have the opportunity to move forward. But I think the opportunity has now been somewhat undermined by the fact that these opposition protests and the actions of Leopoldo Lopez and Maria Corina Machado have been timed to almost coincide with what might be perceived by radicals in the MUD as the opening up of a gap between Capriles and anti-government supporters. So I think this is what the opposition at the moment, the students and Lopez and Machado have sought to exploit, and I think that is to the detriment of Venezuela's national interest, and I think it is to the detriment of the MUD and the enormous strides forward that Capriles has made over recent years. All of this brings me to my second point in terms of what's happening in Venezuela, which is that nothing could be better for the government of Maduro than what is currently happening within the Venezuelan opposition. I would argue that Maduro was initially a very weak and fragile candidate and ultimately an initially weak and fragile president. For Maduro, finding his feet and for his leadership and authority to be asserted, nothing has served him better, nothing has enabled him better than the actions of the opposition. Immediately after April's election, when we had this orchestrated post-election violence, and then the current situation now. And my really strong belief in terms of the way Venezuela is going to move forward is that these opposition protests today will strengthen Maduro within the ruling PSUV, and it will also lead to a hardening of the ideological tendencies within that organisation. In much the same way that the coup and the opposition actions of 2002 transformed Chavismo from what was initially a moderate third-way project into socialism of the 21st century. So I think this has been a remarkable turn of events for Maduro. The challenges he faced internally within the PSUV, in my opinion, were immense. He faced serious dangers, serious threats from other competitors, and I think that he has been really enabled to bring the PSUV around him to assert unity and leadership because of the external context. And just to really contextualize the challenges that Maduro faced, there is always the problem that when you are following a transformative and charismatic leader, that there is going to be an enormous void that you have to fill. And this was the challenge that Maduro was facing. I think, personally, Maduro would have been found wanting. But I think circumstances have really solidified his position. This isn't a problem which is unique to Venezuela. We saw this in the United Kingdom when we had the delights of Margaret Thatcher, and then after Thatcher we had John Major. Okay, bit of a serious gap that John Major had to fill there. Ronald Reagan, and then George Bush I, which very few people remember. Or the most poignant example, which I hope Francisco will relate to, Sir Alex Ferguson, David Moyes. So the challenge that David Moyes and Nicolás Maduro are facing is how you keep your team on side, how you stop players trying to assert their different opportunities and tendencies at a moment of real crisis in your political organisation. And this, as I said, has been facilitated for Maduro because of this violence and this new trend of the opposition of taking us back to 2002. Further assisting Maduro, further making what is really quite a mess in some respects that is inherited in terms of two really critical post-Chavez legacies, the situation of chronic insecurity and violence and economic dysfunction and dislocation. Rather than attention being on those issues right now, these really acutely urgent problems, the attention is back on the political division and the polarized political discourse. So Maduro is once again being enabled to consolidate his position because we're all being deflected and distracted because of the political activities which are occurring on the street. What we are not doing, and what this actually allows Maduro to do, is not deal with the really serious problems that Venezuela is facing. What it allows Maduro to do is just tinker at the edges. Because there's no pressure on Maduro right now to have to deal with really pressing macro-political and macroeconomic problems. Rather than talking about the ideological contradictions of the political economy of 21st century socialism, which is really the problem Venezuela is facing today, we are talking instead about what is happening on the streets. So what's happening in Venezuela then, just to bring this second point to a close, is I think we are going to see a protracted economic deterioration, as I said, and a worsening security situation. But, ironically, this is going to be in the context of the government consolidating, of Maduro consolidating. And this is what makes Venezuela so perplexing for people to observe. On the one hand, we have this image of crisis, and yet on the other hand, we're going to see government strengthening. So this then brings me to my third and final point in terms of what's happening in Venezuela, and you've all been very tolerant of my remarks so far, so we'll see if this pushes you over the edge. And that is that we are seeing, in my opinion, and I'll give you my explanations of this, a continued campaign of disinformation around what is going on in the country. Now, what we have seen repeatedly in reporting on Venezuela, the media on Venezuela, political risk analysis of Venezuela, has been a failure to contextualize events and to adequately explain the processes underway in the country. And as a result of this, for the last 12, 13, 14 years, people have not been able to understand the durability of either Hugo Chavez or now Maduro, because of this constant decontextualization. Now, I think this is also a factor of continued external interference, or in diplomatic language we call it engagement, by the United States in Venezuela. And there's been a very, very important shift. And this isn't to go all Eva Gollinger and conspiracy theory on you. It is indeed to say that what you need to do is look at the financing and financial allocations of the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute. And what you'll see is that from 2002 through to around 2008, the focus of these resources, this external funding to the Venezuelan opposition, went to the opposition political parties, it went to the opposition trade union movements, and it went to the opposition business associations. It also went to sections of the opposition media. After 2008, when it was clear these were not vehicles for regime change, the whole focus of this democratic assistance funding shifted. And it shifted after 2008 to youth movement engagement, youth media training. We're not talking about insignificant sums of money here, which if you look at a recent FRID report from Spain, talks about initially a tranche of $6 million being allocated to the Venezuelan student movement in 2009. But these shifts in patterns of funding also coincide with what we've seen after 2009, 10, 11, 12, where we are today, which is the increasing vocalization and mobilization of the Venezuelan student movement. There's been a lot of attention on the fact that 3 people were killed this week. 2 students were killed in January 2010, and yet that received hardly any coverage, hardly any information came out about that. Which kind of leads me back to this point that we have got currently an orchestration of events and attention on the country. Now, the problem for me is, and I was actually quite horrified yesterday because there is an opposition blog called Caracas Chronicles, which some of you may be familiar with, and I found myself agreeing with Francisco Toro in Caracas Chronicles from completely opposite perspectives, which is we saw this before, we saw it in 2002, and it did not work then. So this idea that with external financial support and by media disinformation you can change the political situation in Venezuela is wrong. It's not going to happen. Because the people the Venezuelan opposition have to convince is Venezuelan voters, not international opinion. So in terms of this point here about contextualizing, and just to try and draw this to a close, I think what's really benefiting the current disinformation we're receiving, and when we talk about disinformation, it's really looking at the kind of media images and messages which have been coming out of Venezuela for the last few days. What benefit is it to the Venezuelan opposition movement, to these students who are claiming that they want to achieve change, that they are circulating images of a student being beaten up by the police? But then it turns out that this image is an Egyptian policeman beating up a student. Or I was emailed the other day from somebody in the Iranian Green movement, emailing me an image of the Policia Metropolitana beating up a student. The Policia Metropolitana was disbanded in 2011. If you have a legitimate political grievance and are frustrated and wanting political change, it discredits the cause that you have to disseminate information which is not viable and which does not give the international community confidence in the claims that you are putting forward about the political regime in that country. So in terms of contextualizing events, the other point that I'd like to make here as well also relates to some of the comments that have been made today and yesterday by John Kerry. He's called John Kerry, isn't he? Yeah. In Washington, where he was expressing his severe concern at the fate of scores of students who have been arrested in Venezuela. A couple of years ago, right outside these doors on those streets, 156 British students were arrested in protests over student fees. John Kerry wasn't expressing his concern about British students. We didn't have the Iranian Green movement praying for British students as they are praying for Venezuela's students now. So we have to contextualize the reality. We have to get things into perspective. We can talk the language of dictatorship, but back this up with credible information. Realize that you are trying to appeal to people who are sensitive to fact-based arguments. So to conclude then, in terms of what's happening in Venezuela, and I'm still standing, so I'll just round it up now while I'm ahead, is I think what we're actually seeing is the dynamic of a decade ago. Firstly, we are seeing the opposition. They might have the chance to rein this back, and I really do hope Capriles does rein this back. The opposition disconnecting itself from the electoral support that it needs if it is to achieve political change and if it is to achieve political change in the country peacefully. Secondly, we are seeing an ideologically eclectic government and ruling party consolidating itself and its political project by default. However, unlike a decade ago, this is taking place against the backdrop of a far more challenging situation of insecurity, and it is taking place against a far more complicated and distorted economic picture. So I think the outcome for Maduro is going to be infinitely more difficult than it was for Hugo Chavez. I'll quit now.
Okay, I guess there will be a few questions. Please tell to which of the panelists are you asking the question. So you first.
I have
short question, please. Short question.
I'm actually going to ask the first question, and then I'm going to go around. Whoever wants to ask the question, you will be the first one, of course.
Okay.
And just raise your hand. I will hold the microphone for you, and you can just speak into the microphone. Just ask a question briefly, since I know many of you have many questions. So something I forgot to do at first is introduce myself. My name is Vanessa Zavala. I'm a Venezuelan. I am a Master's Student of Development Studies at the London School of Economics, and I'm also the Venezuelan Society President here. So my question is, one of the reasons a lot of Venezuelans, to all of the panel, one of the main reasons Venezuelans feel like they need to go to the streets is because the government has been considered illegitimate to them. That there is no way to have justice within going to an election because they think that it's not going to be fair, that people from the opposition don't get to count the votes. So this feeling of frustration that has been tried by going through campaigns is being let out through protests. And even though it may not be the most viable way to go towards democratic way, how can the society of Venezuelans, the citizens, make this a movement that will, instead of focusing on the violence and focusing on the main protests, focus on the real issues of the economic and the social problems and dilemmas that Venezuelans face? Thank you.
Off you go, George.
Well, I would have thought that for most Venezuelans, economic issues are rather important. And we're in a situation of economic downturn, which is likely to get worse. It will take years to get investment into the oil industry and get production to where it needs to be to resolve the main economic issues facing the country. And during all of that time, the government is vulnerable. I would have thought that, I partly agree with Julia. I think that some of the rhetoric of the opposition is worrying. And I would have thought that one of the reasons the 2002 coup failed was the fear that you would end up with a Pinochet or with some sort of unpleasant right-wing regime which would impose dictatorship. I would have thought that the important thing now is to encourage a democratic solution of some sort or another to current difficulties. That's not going to be easy, and it's easier said than done. But I would have thought that was the way to go.
Yeah, I agree with George. I think one of the main failings of the opposition is over the past decade or so has been the complete failure to sort of portray to the population how the economy should be doing. I mean, yeah, to make the basic point that it is not normal to have inflation at levels that it's currently at. I mean, I appreciate that inflation in Venezuela has always been fairly high, but not nearly at recent levels. That it's not normal to to have fundamental difficulties in accessing dollars. It's not normal to have price controls on some goods and on others. For the prices to be going through the roof, and to just make the fundamental comparison within the region that there must be some sort of trained economists within the opposition who could make these comparisons and just say as I did with the slides, Venezuela has been underperforming and is massively underperforming this year, and these are countries with that don't have Venezuela's oil reserves that make the comparison with the Saudi Arabias, that other countries with massive with massive reserves, that Venezuela should not be anywhere near as poor as it is, that people's lives should fundamentally be better, and I think there's been a complete failure on the part of the opposition to do that, and it's almost I kind of get the impression that the government sort of thinks that the economy doesn't matter that much. The economy has deteriorated so much this year, and yet still the opposition didn't manage to do that well in the December local elections. So yeah, I think it kind of gives the government some complacency as well, that it thinks that it can continue with these distortions, because as Julia said, it's not considered a pressing issue, but it should be. People should have that sort of that fundamental conception that their government has failed and failed massively. So I think, in terms of encouraging a sort of democratic transition and steering away from the sort of violent tendencies that we're seeing, I think there should be the focus should be fundamentally on the economy, which is one of the key problems, one of the key problems of Venezuela currently.
On the elections, I'm sure this is probably a point that will be picked up later, that the elections are fraudulent and that they're problematic, and therefore we have no alternative but to go onto the streets. I was an election observer in Barinas in April, and had absolutely no complaints whatsoever about election fraud. We went out of our way to talk to opposition MUD people All of the polling stations, all of the tables that we visited had MUD witnesses on them. I've written about this, and I'm not going to dwell on the arguments about election fraud, because I think that, firstly, if there is election fraud that had occurred in Venezuela, then more substantive evidence should have been brought of this. And secondly, that if there is election fraud, then it really can't be responded to by way of violence. It is about building up a critical mass for peaceful and democratic change. And just picking up on some of the points that were just made in terms of the economy, has the opposition got an economist? The opposition probably has too many economists. I think that's the problem that they have. But then the challenge then is for these economists is that so many of them are focused on trying to judge the Venezuelan government by the standards and the metrics of orthodox liberal economics. The challenge is that's not how the Venezuelan government judges itself. It really makes no sense at all, and no disrespect to, for us to be saying, well, you know, it's outrageous then, you know, look at all these nationalizations. That's what happens when you're trying to build socialism. This is what the Venezuelan government is trying to do. So yes, there are these nationalizations that are occurring. Yes, there is the foreign capital which is leaving the country. And we can sit here and we can appreciate the negative economic consequences of that. But the point is that the government is putting forward ideological arguments as to why it wants to be doing that, how it is trying to transform the nature of the Venezuelan economy. And as much as we may be horrified by Venezuela having the world's highest level of inflation, that doesn't seem to be mobilizing people who feel that they're getting dividends delivered to them by other means, through non-cash means, through increases in the minimum wage. Yes, we can sit here and say, well, it's creating an inflationary spiral and isn't this terrible? But the thing is, that's not convincing ordinary Venezuelan voters who remain committed to the view that the Maduro government and the Chavez government before it was delivering dividends. There may not be access to dollars. We understand, for us, limitations on people's economic freedom. The response for most people, well, we don't really need these dollars. We're not the people who are leaving Venezuela to go overseas. This is the argument that we're trapped in. We have two completely different ideas of what the purpose of the economy is and who controls the economic future of the country. But you cannot judge Maduro and Venezuela by the standards of orthodox liberal economics, because that's not what they're about.
Thank you. My question is for Mrs. Parker. Do you think that the strategic Pacific alliance entered between Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Peru has generated any particular impact on Venezuela economy? Could you elaborate on that, please?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, if anything, it sort of brings into focus the kind of I suppose the reforms that many of those countries have undertaken, and I'm personally not hugely convinced of. I mean, I think the Pacific Alliance has got a lot of press in recent months, but I mean, there are regional. Many countries in the region are already highly integrated. They have a lot of their trade is done on without tariffs anyway. But I think it kind of highlights that these are the really rapid growing Latin American states. These are the, I spend quite a lot of time speaking to clients who are thinking of investing in the region, and everyone asks about the Pacific Alliance. I'm not surprised it's come up today. And they're talking about investing in these countries, and I don't think that there are. I mean, some companies will be leaving Venezuela because of Venezuela's specific problems, and maybe they'll move operations to Colombia or other countries in the region. Maybe they already have done, but I don't think that the creation of the Pacific Alliance in itself is going to have, a direct impact, negative impact on Venezuela. But perhaps it brings into focus, those kind of the comparisons we see in the press all the time. These rapid growing, great, places to do business, and the kind of the Venezuela and Argentina of the region. So I think maybe it's a question of sort of it's a reputational issue in the press.
Then you don't think that this alliance would affect commercial relations between Venezuela and some of its commercial partners in South America?
I mean, potentially. I think what we've seen in trading relations is that they've actually been relatively stable. I mean, even relations between Venezuela and Colombia over the years, there's been a lot of, negative or kind of fluctuations in terms of the diplomatic relationship with Colombia and also with the United States. But a lot of that is for show, to be quite frank. Colombia remains one of Venezuela's most important trading partners. For all the bluster, for all the, kind of headlines that you see, actually, you know, Venezuela's dependent on Colombian imports. It's not gonna jeopardize that trade. I mean, particularly you know, given current conditions. So no, I actually think trading relations are a lot more stable than perhaps the press would suggest.
Hi, this question is for Julia. I'm going to try and be as civil as possible. There's many points I'd like to touch, but obviously everyone here I know wants to ask. And pardon my ignorance, I'm only 22, so you obviously been studying my country for longer than I've been there.
Or, well, I have indeed, yes.
Or so you claim. But
you would have been 2 when I started my
sorry,
post.
my main point to touch with you is about, you said the amount of disinformation in the media, either within the country, outside of the country. Obviously, social media is a big part right now in the world, with the Arab Springs, anywhere where there's oppression. You say there is very huge amounts of disinformation, such as, well, sorry, the government, in my opinion, as a counterpoint, says that there is a lot of cancer. Sorry, I'm nervous. There's a lot of sabotage within the country, whether it's the power lines, whether it's the food, the crops, it's the military, it's the all the paramilitary groups that they have, you know, all the insecurity. That's all the opposition and the American empire trying to, you know, sorry, just oppress the Venezuelan people.
Is there actually a question? Sorry,
no, sorry. Yeah, I'll get there. I'll get there. My point is, what about the government's disinformation plan? Because as it stands, they claim that nothing is their fault. They've been in charge for 15 years. It's never their issue. It's never them. I believe the students and everyone have the right to complain due to the fact that you know, their government is incompetent. But sorry. Just what about the government disinformation and the fact of their inability to govern over the past 15 years? Sorry.
Do you want me to respond? Well, I'm not really here to, you know, I think, tempting though it is to try and polarize what I think has been a very civil discussion until this point. I'm not going to sit here and really address, is there a government disinformation campaign? My point, when, like Kate, I'm talking to investors, when I'm talking about governments who are involved in Venezuela, when we're looking at what the triggers and dynamics of change are, we looked at what started with this Venezuelan student movement, and we say, this is, you know, what is going to come out of this? Does this have the potential to mobilize people? Does this really have some serious traction? And then the minute that we see images of Bulgarian police beating up students being circulated on Twitter, then it just tells us we're just back where we are all over again. So whether we want to argue about, you know, these things were being sent to me. So my opinion is formed on what I've experienced over the last week, and sympathy I may or may not have with the students is dissipated the minute I worry that the same mistakes that we saw committed 10 years ago are being committed again. Yes, students have a right to a voice, but the whole of Venezuela has a right to a voice, and that's not served through violence, burning tires, and Molotov cocktails.
I agree, and it's also the
Well, no, you raise your hand.
There are people. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Hi. Yeah, sorry. Hi. This is obviously to go along the same line. I found myself that actually I was agreeing in a lot of the arguments that you put across here, but specifically on the argument of misinformation. I think it's misinformation on both sides, and you have not put the other side where there is a lot of media coverage and media images from the government saying about the country coming out in massive amount to support Maduro. And images showing, for example, the Pepsi Bowl is still in one of the areas of the city where it's not been in Venezuela, in Caracas, for about 15 years. And actually, the opposition's taken those images and put the real image behind it. So I understand what you're saying about misinformation, but you have to say both sides. And also, you have to think about the point that it might be beneficial for the government to put out images that are not quite right. So that is an option and possibility. I'm not saying that, you know, the Bulgarian, you know, it was all, but it can be. And we have seen that, you know, our students are, you know, suffering violence. And basically what I came to ask is, what do we do to stop that misinformation? What? I mean, I know that you said that it's a big problem, but we're here and we're trying to help our people there. What do we do other than maybe pass on images that are truly, truly moving? So what is it that we should be doing?
One thing is, there are a lot of very different opinions here, but we are here to listen to each other and to give as many people as possible the possibility of raising questions. First, respect all the people that are making questions. Try to be brief and make questions, not political points, and sort of let's keep it in terms of the academic debate.
Can I just complete?
Yeah, go.
I agree with you. And I think one of the things the government learned from 2002 is that it has to engage in a media campaign as well. And this is part of this spiral. I do agree with you, and I'm sorry if I came across as not being sympathetic to the need for that balance, but in 20 minutes what I'm supposed to explain is what the situation is in the country. And my argument would be that the consolidation of the Maduro government right now doesn't depend on a media disinformation campaign. The opposition student campaign does. Please don't put me in the position of thinking about what is the solution to this. I'm happy to be part of any framework that you want people to participate in. But right now is not the time for us to be able to do that. But I would be more than happy to take that forward.
Yeah.
Hello, Eduardo Baudet, study at the LSE. So sorry about not being that political, but on a more sober and objective and kind of boring subject. Other than the economy, where did Chavez go wrong, and how did the government try to amend those errors, be it in the judicial system, in the inflation, economy, or in the crime rate? Thank you. I mean,
Yeah.
based on this, obviously, on Julia, but any input from the panel would be Kate as well.
Well, I can talk from an economic perspective, which I think, you know, many of the problems that Venezuela is facing today, or many of the most serious problems in terms of the economy, are related to a completely sort of unsustainable, well, in my opinion, unsustainable mix of you can't put in place price controls, exchange controls, but at the same time just print money, you know, like there's no tomorrow. You know, it's going to create distortions, and what we're seeing today is the build-up of those distortions. So for me, that was the fundamental sort of problem. And you know, I acknowledge Julia's point that, you know, it is difficult to, you know, to judge other countries' economic management using your own metrics. But for me, it's just, you know, it's plain maths. You know, you can't. You know, I always think politics aside, you know, you can tell a lot about an economy by just looking at the numbers. And kind of Venezuela's speak for itself. I mean, it's, yeah, regardless of the, you know, the political projects, the you know, the money that has been spent on that Chavez did spend on anti-poverty programs, it's causing problems. That is causing inflation, and you know, that is affecting people's lives. And I appreciate that people are finding ways around that, and that it's not perhaps sufficient problem for people to, you know, to vote for the opposition. But actually, a kind of related point that I meant to make in my presentation was that, you know, there's a lot of focus on who should be leading Venezuela, but not much focus on what they're going to do, you know. And actually, I think even if the opposition did get in any, you know, in the next kind of 5-10 years, it's, you know, there's going to be a crisis, and it's not. People assume that if the opposition gets in, that all of a sudden these problems are going to be solved, and that's not the case. You know, things will have to get worse before they get better, and the kind of long-term investment that's needed to develop the oil industry and to develop sort of long-term productive capacity, and just to, things like, industry which is just completely stagnated. I mean, these are long-term issues, and not to kind of be too depressing about it, but there is no easy solution, and things, would probably get worse with a change of government before they got better. So,
I think there's a genuine element of damned if you do and damned if you don't of the present situation. You can go for an OPEC type of national policy, but you'll have problems with producing oil and problems with production, which are already serious enough. Or you can try and go through private investment and create political issues that may very well lead to the reversal of the same policy a few years down the road. So either policy is fraught with difficulties. I think, as it were, when did it go wrong? Oil, among all areas, is one in which you've got to be able to work with people of different political persuasions, because human capital is fundamental. Not just anybody can produce a barrel of oil. You need to know quite a lot about how you go about doing it and where you drill and how you produce and so on. And the idea that you select people on political grounds for positions in PDVSA is not a good one. And I think that Venezuela has paid a price for that sort of attitude. He who is not with me is against me. And that sort of is not clever. Obviously, you can't employ people who are sitting outside PDVSA offices with a bomb in their hand. But you've got to be, I think, a little bit more tolerant to people whose views are slightly different.
Okay, my name is Domingo Lapadula. I wanted to put forward one thing that I call the elephant in the room every time that we go to this sort of meeting, and it's about the problem with the security in general, and how many people are dying, an uncalled war that we have going on. And for you all three, as an analyst that are seeing from
just
afar
a question. Try to make a question, not an intervention.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. And then the question is how you analyze really that, and how that is working in terms of the effect on how we are seeing from other people and what can be done about. So I appreciate that you mentioned that a little bit on the side, and from the economical side, we didn't even touch it. Mm-hmm. So how we touch that and really try to address the problem. Actually, for none in special, I would like to see what things you can put forward.
This is security. Security.
Yeah.
Security.
Yeah, the safety of the people and how many people are dying.
Well, I think the security situation is diabolical. You have more people dying in Venezuela than are dying in Mexico's drug wars, which is a horrific situation. And I think that the problem really lays within, and it goes back to the earlier question on judicial issues, which is that under Chavez we had something like 12 different interior ministers. So we had this constant turnover. You can't formulate a coherent security agenda or address issues to do with the rule of the law if you have no institutional continuity. And the problem is that every time a minister left the Interior Ministry and Justice, then another one came in but brought in their people as well. So you didn't even have any lower level continuity. So I think the way forward in terms of the security has to really relate to having this institutional coherence in Venezuela. I think there is an under-focus on the drivers of insecurity in Venezuela. I used to work in peace studies, and I think one of the biggest conundrums about Venezuela is that we've actually seen an increase in insecurity and violence alongside a reduction in poverty. Now, nobody has really, I read a lot of journals, and nobody's really exploring that in Venezuela. And I think that is a pretty serious issue, and one that turns on its head most of our understandings of what are the roots of insecurity and violence, which is usually and traditionally linked to poverty. But I think the government's other big mistake was that it also viewed violence and insecurity as a result of the capitalist system. That was quite blatantly not the true driver of violence in Venezuela. And the other issue relates to the police situation, and I think the decentralization of policing in Venezuela in the 1990s was a disaster. And I think until you have a unified police force in Venezuela which is compliant with the international norms of security sector reform, then we will have an ongoing problem of insecurity. But the challenge is, how do we re-centralize the police when there is such a lack of overall confidence among some sectors in national policing being in the government's hands? And that's the dilemma. But it's not a dilemma unique to Venezuela. It's a dilemma in a lot of countries coming out of conflict.
Yeah, and also a lot of countries where economies are, are doing much better. I mean, Mexico is kind of the current sort of darling of. It seems to have sort of turned the corner in terms of, there's a lot of investment going into Mexico and then going into the areas where, crime close to the U.S. border. I mean, that's the centre of sort of U.S. hub manufacturing, and it is an issue for companies who are invested in those regions, but it's not. Crime in itself is not a determining factor about whether a company will invest in a country or not. And you look at many other oil producers, Nigeria. There are lots of companies, foreign companies, are used to doing business in places that are ridden with crime. So I suppose from an economic perspective, it's not the determining factor, but it is a factor definitely. And it's again, I think a reputational sort of. Issue of you see headlines about Caracas being one of, if not the most dangerous city in the world, and it doesn't sort of it doesn't fill people with confidence. So I mean I think there's an issue and a big issue, but it's not the be all and end all for foreign companies who I think sort of issues with access to dollars and remitting preferences are much more sort of top of the list in terms of investors.
I'll be brief. I really don't know.
My question is for Julia. You mentioned during your panel that the current events that are going on in Venezuela are counterproductive for the opposition. In a hypothetical situation in which you found yourself to be an advisor to the opposition, what would you suggest would be a good path for them to continue in order to turn this around and for Maduro not to come out stronger, but for them to come on top?
As I said before, I have worked with many people in Venezuela. Julio Borges, I knew Julio when he was here in the UK at Oxford doing his PhD, and the idea that somehow I would not engage with the opposition is an anathema to me because I've worked in lots of peace and conflict contexts. What's going on in Venezuela, as I said before, is not unique. In terms of responding on what if the opposition asked me to be their advisor, then I would have no problem with that. And because I would be desperate to contribute in any way that I could to finding a pacific and a democratic solution to what is going on in Venezuela today. So in terms of what I would advise them, I go back to the response that I gave to the lady sat in front of you. I think that requires a whole bigger forum. And it's not fair on me, the panel, the rest of the audience who are sick to death of hearing what I've got to say, for me to start expounding my views right now in terms of what I would advise the opposition. But I think there is an opposition that can be engaged with, and I think there are optimistic scenarios for Venezuela. I think the challenge is just convoking those, identifying those, what we call the core of the onion in peace-building terms. Go to the Klingendahl Institute. Really identify those core actors and stakeholders that we can engage in dialogue. The Carter Center tried it. I was part of some of those exercises. They failed. We've got to take those lessons learned forward. Nobody ever did.
I think that there. Yeah.
That poor lady over there is just...
Okay, you're the last. I give you the last question. Okay, you first and then you last.
But not if it's a really bad question, okay?
I'm sorry.
Which one?
You.
The gentleman?
Yeah, and then you. Okay? Right.
Hi all, thank you for your remarks. My question's short. I'm curious about the effects of recent events on government discussions about steadily removing oil subsidies. Do you think this will paralyze government plans, or could the crisis allow them to do things that they couldn't otherwise get away with politically? Any of them?
Personally, I don't think it's going to make a blind bit of difference. I mean, I think the subsidies over the years have grown. They're so huge that I think the government would need to raise petrol prices by something like, it's well over 2,000 times for it to actually cover production costs. And so there's no notion that they're going to be raised by even anywhere approaching that much. So yeah, I mean, yeah, even if they were raised by, I don't know, 8 times, 10 times, it's not going to make any difference in terms. I mean, the subsidy is still going to be huge. If you actually look at how rapidly sort of petrol consumption is or oil consumption in the country is rising, just because people regard it as free, associated problems of utilities. It's just consumption has been rising rapidly. So I actually don't think that in economic terms it's going to make much difference. Yeah, I think it kind of made the headlines across the world, but I don't think really it's like a major issue. So.
I have a bee in my bonnet about subsidies on petrol. It seems to me they're straightforward subsidies to the middle class and regressive in every possible way, economically damaging, and in terms of society, damaging as well. I would welcome enormously an increase in petrol prices in Venezuela. I think it'll do quite a lot of good. But whether they will do it and whether they will make it stick when they have done it is rather difficult to know. Certainly, it's interesting that Evo Morales tried to put the price of gasoline up in Bolivia, and there were so many riots he had to withdraw the proposal and take it back again. Whether even Maduro could make it stick when Chavez didn't must be questionable. Lovely idea if you could do it, though.
Yeah, my question is for Julia. I'm sorry if I try to make you monitor forecaster, but I try to go against the grain. So is it very likely that what's happening now can end up consolidating the government? My question is, I know for a fact that Chavismo is not as monolithic as we tend to believe from the outside. So what are the chances of the change not coming from the opposition, of the change coming from within Chavismo? And the changes that in the country are needed coming from within the Chavista ranks that are discontent, but are in no way identified with the ideological spectrum of the opposition. So how do you see that happening in the future years, that the change that would come from within Chavismo and not from the opposition that we are tending to, like the mainstream thought?
I think that's a really good question. We were talking about it actually before we were, grandly welcomed into the room together. And when I was doing some kind of risk projections for the consultancy firms that I worked for in 2011, 2012, we were actually predicting that the biggest risk to Maduro came from within Chavismo. That for all those reasons I said before, think Sir Alex Ferguson, David Moyes and the decline of Manchester United, we just didn't see this as something that Maduro would be able to sustain and hold together, and because there was far more powerful actors within the PSUV than Maduro, and also I think ideologically Maduro represented a smaller faction within the PSUV in terms of the kind of Marxist tendencies that he represents compared to other factions within the PSUV. And I think that Maduro was actually looking like a lame duck in 2012. I think the military was a very, very important and decisive actor here, and I think what's happened is that all of this has swung back around Maduro, because all of those factions who may have opposed him from within the PSUV all together have more to lose if he's removed from power. And this is the big challenge that the opposition has now going forward. So I do think that there was the possibility that Maduro would have been challenged. We were talking about Cabello before when we came in. But I think, and the grassroots community organizations who have been so marginalized within the Chavista project, I think they could have been a real driver of change in Venezuela. And I think what we're seeing now, the most recent announcement on the PSUV, is that they're moving towards this deeper homogenization of the party to try and make it more of a monolith. 2 years ago, I think Maduro would have failed. I think under current conditions, Maduro will be able to drive it through. I think it's to the detriment of the PSUV in the long term, but I think, and I'm sorry to say it, but I do think the opposition's actions are welding that loyalty around Maduro and stopping those kind of cleavages from emerging. And the same thing happened under Chavez in 2007. When Chavez shifted in 2007 towards this whole new strategy then of, 21st century socialism, they lost a lot of people then. They lost people like Margarita Lopez Maya, they lost a lot of centrist people who left the project. And I thought that those physios would have really developed then. But once again, it was welded back together. So it's these external forces that are so central to my mind to keeping Bolivarianism on the road.
Okay.
Yeah, hello.
No, sorry, but
Actually, no, don't worry, I don't have anything.
George, you want to say something?
Yeah, that'd be good.
Okay. Okay, yes, it'll be the last question.
I have no question except to say thank you. It's been very informative, and everybody's notes there has been. I just want to note that whereas Dr. Julia's voice has been in one particular vein, which is to inform us on the what to, when it came to the financial and situation of the country, this is Mrs. Parker?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but you did a very good, expose of everything, but your voice was just caving down on you because of the whole situation. She's gone through
I'm actually ill as well.
tonsillitis.
Got tonsillitis.
It was like, oh my God, it's like, excuse the language.
She's a metaphor.
Like we're in the deep shit.
We have.
Okay, can we have one more question? She's been waiting a while. Quick, wrap it up.
Sorry, but we have to finish. Okay.
Hello, my name is Christina, and I do my undergrad here. I'm Venezuelan, and my question is for Julia. Don't worry, it's not what I would like to get into. I'm going to put that to the side. Actually, briefly mentioned it has to do with Chavez's discourse, and you mentioned after the 2002 events how he changed his whole strategy basically, and he went into this socialism of the 21st century. So my question is, to what extent did Chavez use his discourse to either legitimize or
Chavistas.
like Chavez used his discourse, to like legitimize his regime, and how do you think his discourse, if it played a big tool in his success?
Okay, very quick answer. Obviously, the discourse was important in terms of giving him that charismatic authority, which gave him the legitimacy and the centrality in the organisation. But I think why 2002 was important was because the Chavistas realised they needed to move quick. They'd been dawdling around for 4 years, talking about constitutional reform. They suddenly realised that what had saved Chavez was the people who came down and turned back the coup. So what was the immediate result of that? They introduced the Misiones. Chavez realised that what he was really dependent on in terms of his stability going forward was being insulated from the pressure of the United States. So what happens after 2002? We have the ALBA, we have regional integration initiatives all accelerated. So my argument would be that all of the programmes and policies that the government introduced as a result of the coup, and which became the core characteristics of the 21st century socialism model, the Bolivarian model, all of this was really driven and influenced by what happened between 2002 and 2004. The point we made before about the media, well, the government learned then. The private sector media was very, very dominant. What did the government learn? We're going to put the resources in community media and build up the community media. So the Misiones, regionalisation initiatives, purging the military in PDVSA, all the direct result of what happened between 2002 and 2004, and which transformed the ideological basis of what, as I said before, was intended as this kind of moderate third-way movement. People seem to constantly be reminded Chavez was here and cited Tony Blair as his role model in 1998. Nobody does that anymore, I can tell you.
Casey and George, you want to have the last word?
Yeah.
I will ask, sorry, before we go, Auti Vivas from Venezuela has asked to close it.
Hello, good evening. To everyone who came, thank you so much. I will be very brief because I've lost my voice. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. I would like to express our gratitude to the London School of Economics for allowing us to use their wonderful facilities, and also to our speakers, Dr. Julia Buxton, Ms.Kate Parker, Dr. George Philip, and our chairman tonight, Mr. Francisco Panixa. I think I speak on behalf of everyone in this room when I say I'm deeply concerned about the events taking place in Venezuela as we speak. Our group, Venezuelans in the UK, together with LSESU Venezuelan Society, we have organized this event with the objective of creating spaces for much-needed dialogue. At the same time, to promote awareness about Venezuela's social, economical, and political situation. We are planning to have another event very, very soon, probably this week. I can't give you much details because obviously we need to process all the permits to be able to do anything in the streets, to protest or to... we're planning something very soon. For more information, you can follow us on Facebook, it's Vene UK, or we have also a group for Spanish speakers. We have a group called Venezolanos en el Reino Unido, and we also have an a page on Facebook called Vene UK, and that all the information there with all the latest news about Venezuela, all the videos and pictures of what's happening at the moment. Also, LSE Venezuelan Society is going to have a meeting next Wednesday on the 26th. For more information, go to their page, Facebook. It's also LSESU Venezuelan Society. And just, it's not confirmed just yet, but as some of you might know, Amnesty International spoke out over the serious violations of human rights in Venezuela. So we're hoping to do an event, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. If we can, we'll do it next week, but obviously we're still sorting out things. It's a lot of preparations. We started to plan this event in December with Vanessa, who's the other co-host. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and we'll be gathering outside to take some pictures, whoever wants to stay with their flags, and obviously to send our love and support to the people in Venezuela that are going through a really difficult time tonight. Good night.
I thought it would be more polarised, so thank you. Yeah. But, yeah. Well, no, I mean, yeah, I think we gave a really balanced view, actually. I don't think anyone said anything particularly controversial. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Julia says. Yeah. Yeah, that's Julia said that, but yeah, it's really interesting. So
maybe the programs that the government has implemented,
they don't build anything. That's the thing. So yeah. I'll give you. Oh, you've got my. There you go.
How are you? Thank you so much for
No, not at all. So, yeah, sorry, it wasn't very focused.
I understand you were
Okay, yeah, sure.
I understand that you're also engaged
Thank you.
economic issues with operations, not only with Venezuela, right?
Yeah, we do. So basically, I work for the LATAM team, but we have.
I'm from Mexico, so I would be very interested. You know, given
my colleague's Mexican, so
the recent economic reform and the financial reform.
It's really interesting.
The issue regarding security, which in my view is being a little exaggerated. Could I get your card?
Yeah, of course, yes. Yeah.
My name is Joaquin. I'm
It's good to meet you.
UCL LLM Street.
Okay, yeah, well, drop me a line. So, yes, do you too. Yeah, of course, yes, yeah. That's okay. Oh, sorry, I've got to shoot. I'll get a train. So, yeah. No, it's really interesting. So, yeah, okay, good to meet you. Yeah, bye.
you later. Sorry. Sorry, what did you say? I thought you said, do you want to come and smoke? And I'm like, well, appropriate right now? Oh, thank you very, very much. Thank you. I was a bit nervous about how it may go. No, I live here. I commute. Oh, really? Oh, fantastic. My university is near St. Stephen's. So it's already ready. Oh, wow. Oh, that would be fantastic. It's very cold at the moment. I like a compliment after a long day. But have a fantastic trip. Thank you. Okay. No worries. Of course you can. I thought that was right. That's why I don't know what to do. I think at the moment, I don't think we're going to is right on the trip. And because Cabello is staying in Maduro right now. I think if when Cabello decides that Maduro can no longer protect the legacy of Chavez, that's when things might change. But at the moment, Diosdado has too much to do.
So what about Chavistas? Are they
Yeah, this is really making people, you know.
because no one really knows.
Well, I think, you know, people who are... I was last in Venezuela in November, and I went down to Bolivar, and I went to Aragua, and I think people who are Chavistas, you know, you have the Chavistas, as you know, the Chavistas, the anti-Chavistas, and the people in the middle. And the Chavistas are slowly draining off, I think. But they're moving into the middle, they're not moving to the opposition. So I think there is disaffection. I think a lot of people don't like, you know, the unions, I think, are a big problem for Maduro. And nobody's talking about this. I think, you know, what's going on in the union movement, because the workers want worker control and Maduro wants state control, and that's a big fight that's going on. But, you know, this at the moment, it just, everybody has to stay together, and that's the big thing at the moment. Good luck. Take care. Oh! Oh, yeah, do you mind? I don't Facebook, I'm too old for Facebook. We never got any forensic evidence of that.
It was media images as well. But you know,
oh, right, okay.
There are Twitter.
I don't know which way you're coming from.
There's, I mean, I have seen that because I have friends that are Chavistas and they send me those articles of like how you said things that are but those images where you can actually see that they're uniforms and as well as the destitution of Cortez from the OAS, you know, just for bringing attention to the fact that Chavez was not seen and not what could be done. But doesn't that bring, you know, a focus on the fact that the government is just being run?
Yeah, but the government, absolutely, but the government can manipulate this. But you see, the benefit the government has is that in 2002, 2004, it was revealed that the opposition, people no, if you look at the moment who's come out in support of the government, issued these kind of proclamations of solidarity. Bolivia has, UNASUR has, Latina has,
fairly easy to do when you send out
Well, but that's not the point. It's really not the point. Because the point is at the moment that government is being reinforced by those shows of solidarity. That is the point.
Sorry, it's just put on the spot. Think about it. Lots of signing petitions, and I've seen a petition that has 70,000 signatures already. Sending the
But you know what your problem is there? The problem is there. The government doesn't recognise the OAS. It doesn't recognise the OAS. It's building the CELAC. It's building the ALBA. So it's back to this what I was saying before. For the opposition to make headway, the comments that we made. This is a government. Yes, they nationalise the building socialism. No, they're not going to listen to the OAS because they don't believe in the OAS. By the way, you did this. That's the reality.
Hello. Oh, no, that's fine.
I think the big mistake...
No problem.
Dale.
He's kind
of washed his hands.
But I think he needs to be...
Majority of human trafficking is males.
And he needs, there's no point. At the moment, he's just saying, look, I'm not happy with all, I mean, that man, for the last 3-4 years, what we've been waiting for him to do is to stand up and assert really firm leadership and just say, this is a disgrace, what is going on. We want peaceful change, and we want democratic change. If he just had that, then I think people who are these people in the middle, they would really start saying, actually, this guy does have a vision, this guy does have a project. But at the moment, he's just not got balls. And he's allowing Maria Corina Machado has got balls. She's got her lady balls, yeah? And what she's doing, I don't agree with her language and I don't agree with her strategy, and I've met Maria Corina and I really struggle with, some of the things that she does. Because I don't think it is a way that is going to be, even if the students overturn the government, right, it's just going to be even more chaos. It's not going to be less chaos. I know.
And then they obviously force you to get incarcerated, and now it's just obviously escalating. And I think the reason a lot of people, some of the people are part of that change this stuff really outside international intervention.
It's not going to happen.
With what happened, I don't know if you heard, but Leopoldo Lopez has been arrested.
Has he actually been arrested? That must have only been in the last couple of hours.
Yeah, like recently.
Right.
He gave a speech and then he said, I'm not independent. If my turning in to the authorities can wake Venezuela up, and so be it, I will go. What do you think will happen?
But he won't do it! It's theatre!
I don't know what's going to happen with people in Venezuela. He did turn in, he's arrested.
Right.
But what do you
It depends
think
what Capriles does.
will happen? I've been trying to follow him from Twitter. I've been trying to follow him, what he said, like his post in March today.
I know, I've been following him as well when I've not been receiving all these really abusive tweets. But you see, the thing is with Lopez, and I have to say, it's... I knew Julio Borges very well, and I knew a lot of the people in Primera Justicia very well. When they were right back in the 90s, and they started off as, what was it called? They had an organisation before they became Primera Justicia. It was like a citizen something or other, and and I think Julio is a really lovely guy, and I think he's a really great guy, and I've actually been really disappointed because I think Julio Borges could have been far more important. I mean, he's, kind of...
Well, at least from what I don't know, you probably think otherwise.
No, I agree. But that's a good thing, because that's where it should actually happen.
But, and then obviously you have a lot of the government, they say things and they won't reply, they won't say anything, they just decide to be quiet or whatnot. And in my opinion, there needs to be, not creators, but somebody that questions the legitimacy, somebody that questions all the government's things and just tries to get, because obviously the poor people of the country just try to get them to, because obviously education would be probably the best way.
Absolutely. But I remember Diego Urbaneja, 6, 7, 8 years ago, saying the misiones are a disaster, and we would scrap these. I sat and had an interview with him, and he was saying these are the worst things that could happen. And I was just sitting there thinking, my God, you don't. I did my PhD on La Causa R, so I was in Katia, I was in 23 de Janeiro. I was interviewing poor people about how they saw their political lives changing, and what they saw as the political options. And that strength of allegiance they have to this project can't be underestimated. As much as, I don't think it's sustainable, and inflation's a problem, but what I said, 10 years ago, is that the one thing that would bring down Chavez is if the opposition was led by a working-class black woman. That would change it. But you're not going to change it with Maria Corina Machado, and you're not going to change it with Leopoldo Lopez, and then bringing out Antonio Ledesma.
Yeah, that's I think where the issue is, that obviously we don't have any young new politicians apart from Cortez. If Leopoldo Lopez, apart from the fact he's rehabilitated, so he couldn't have ever run for anything. He would have probably been taken for feelings because he would have maybe been more personal.
Yeah, he's not. No, it's just one of the questions I was watching CNN. One of the questions aimed at Machado was why are most of these protests or being organized in the east part of Venezuela, considered the rich part? And she responded, no, they're everywhere. Because obviously she responded, but it's true. It's more like.
Yeah, but the other problem. Sorry to cut across you. The other thing is as well, you've got to decide what your strategy is. And if your strategy is, I was an English student. When I was a student here, we were out protesting outside South Africa House for Nelson Mandela to be free. We were chaining ourselves to Westminster Bridge for ACT UP, for HIV and AIDS. We've all been angry students. But what's tragic is that I don't think Maria Corina Machado is using the students in a good way. I think that it's a Trojan horse, and I think she was quite instrumental. I was in Georgetown, I was working in Washington for a long time, and I saw a lot of these people who were coming in and out of Washington. And I think Maria Corina has been consistently part of US ideas, and I think she's probably using the students in a way that isn't good for the students. But if they've got time, so the point I was going to make was, you can't on the one hand say, we are being repressed, we are being brutalized, whatever, and then Maria Corina and all these people are sending out these, I've been getting all these images of SOS, people. How have you got time to? People in Egypt haven't got time to do that. If you've got time to do that without the police water cannoning you, firing, arresting you, shooting you, can't have two discourses. And you know what it's like here in UK. We're looking at Syria, we're looking at Afghanistan, we're looking at Iraq.
That's why I left my country and I moved to Canada, Scotland, here.
Scotland, you see, that's going to be a civil war. But yeah, go on.
But in my opinion, I think international intervention is on the side, even though and the power lies with the people in our country. Sadly enough, one of the great things that Chavez did is that the ideology that he planted for the past 14 years in Venezuela, in the country, and the divisions that he created, those will change. Doesn't matter if we have a regime change tomorrow.
I agree.
We win by elections. The hate that people have, even if there's potential use of the hate that people have for one another, whether opposition or not, is tremendous.
I actually thought today I was really surprised. I thought, no disrespect, but I think people were really, good. Not in a patronising way.
It's good fun, but sometimes I was just like
families have been divided.
Oh, I know. I I've lost friends because of it. You know, I've been working in there since 1993.
I lost my ex-boyfriend.
Well, you're well rid of him. You're well rid of him.
That's how much it's affected me.
Anyway, the best of luck. Okay, and be in touch. All right, take care of yourself.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Yeah, we have a forum with Julia.
Yeah, and a bottle of gin would help.
Oh, glad you came.
Thank you guys.
Oh, that's made it worth it. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I know it was a bit difficult, but I really wanted to.
Julia can handle anything.
Listen, I've done things like this in Miami, right? And if you can see
Wow.
My parents live in Toronto.
No, you
so
Oh, Jesus Christ.
yeah.
Sorry, can you get my back? No, I have to say, thank you. I have to say, I thought people were really, really kind. You know, that could have gone really bad, and I think it went
I was
really well.
afraid of that. Like, oh,
Nobody got punched and nobody got...
I've got to get outside yet.
Well, we're here resisting for you.
But no, I thought, you know, and it just, you know, genuinely, if, you know, you can make a difference, then I think it's just so, so important because, you know, we have to just move away from this, you know, and that guy was really sweet at the end, you know, he was really sweet just now. And I think it's just people calming down and just taking some of the emotion out of this because, you know, you're the next generation.
Venezuela is too binary. Everyone is either this or that, where you can actually be in the middle if possible.
I'm taking the pound.
oh no, that is intended for you. And the pen as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Fluffos.
I bought it for you guys. So.
But you know, it's been like that for 14 years and it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Well, maybe, but you know, the tragedy, and this is why I think I was so disappointed with what's going on at the moment, is that we've had that polarisation and now you've got a new generation coming through. And you just wish this new generation, you know, I mean, my family live in Cyprus, so we've had, you know, Greece and Turkey and all that, you know, and the most reactionary people in Greece when they were opening, you know, kind of borders between Greece and Turkish sides of Cyprus was young Greek people, because these young Greek people had had, you know, decades of their parents telling them about the terrible things the Turks have done and stuff like that. And I understand that that's happened in Venezuela, but, you know, there's also such a good chance for young people to just change that dialogue. Change that.
Because either way, you're going to have the other half of the population thinking differently. So might as well try to come to a consensus so you can actually have
You
some
know
kind
what
of...
we'll do? So, I'm sorry, Buxton. The only thing this will do is it'll harden Chavista youth.
Exactly.
So this will just become, you know,
Because it will
generational.
give them something to actually fight for.
Absolutely. When the project is dying, it just creates a whole new generation of young people. You know, and those young people who should be voting for Capriles and NUD will just now kind of, they'll be, you know, mobilised to go out and think that fight, they've got to fight for this.
What do you think of Lopez, like, turning in the documents and turning kind of himself in? Because there was kind of an...
I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, it's not really good.
I don't know, I haven't seen it, but I saw pictures when he, like, that he was out in the street.
But, you know,
So I don't know.
that's theatre. It's not, you know, I don't like Graphics Chronicles, but, you know...
You read that post, didn't you?
Yeah, I read it.
Yeah, the one, because you mentioned it.
Yeah, I thought it was great.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, I thought it
Francis
was brilliant.
Couture.
And it's kind of, you know, what he said about, you know, Lopez's whole salida thing is that this is a hashtag, it's not a strategy.
Exactly.
So Lopez's theatre, that's what it is. It's not a strategy for government.
It's not going to manifest into institutional change.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting that Chavez actually disabled him to be in any kind of politics. Because I just personally think that he has more charisma than Capriles. And I think Chavez saw that and he just disabled him from politics whatsoever. He can't run for any elections, like, officially.
But we can't talk about Venezuela as a regime. Like, that's
I'm genuinely not. I think the only way that this will change and the only candidate who will transform this is if the opposition, and wait for this, this is really valuable, I've been saying it for 15 years, is if the opposition was